Hello, Kevin. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
This is great. I have had the great fortune of reconnecting with a lot of Stanford professors and people who have been pretty prominent in my undergrad. And, people from different disciplines, and most of them have been around computer science, AI, linguistics. But there was one course that I took that was a bit off the beaten path for me, and that was the course that I took with you, Religion in the Information Age. And I just have to say how foundationally challenging that course was, and so it's awesome to be able to geek out about these things again. So thanks again for taking the time to be here.
Yeah, of course. I have a lot of fond memories about that course. It was the first course that I taught on my own, the first course that I sort of created from scratch. And if you recall, it was very experimental, and it was following my own research at the time. Actually,
Hmm.
the content of that course I ended up putting in conference papers that I've delivered a couple times. So it was a special course for me, and close
Oh,
to
and
the real areas of interest.
oh yeah, and it was just so well organized narratively. There was a big sense of progression from figuring out where we are in time. Where has human thought led us? And then, okay, these are the components that we have to reason around finding meaning moving forward. And so I would hope to emulate a little bit of that initial stages of the arc that we covered in the class,
Hmm.
which is not going to happen by any means. But I think maybe if we do, I mean, honestly, I think if we get through History of an Error, I think that would be huge. And then we
Yeah.
can sort of see where we go from there. Why don't we start with History of an Error? Why don't you put us in the seat of Nietzsche as he's writing this
Yeah.
epitaph?
I mean, just to briefly sort of outline that narrative, of the course to sort of give context to this. Um, it, the course to review was taking a look at how we can think about a sort of theory of information, right? We all understand the idea of like, okay, we're in the information age now, the age of the internet. One idea of, or one way of framing like the modern era, right? Um, Cyberspace and that sort of thing. And I've always been really fascinated with science fiction and ideas about modernity and like moving into postmodernity or sort of futurism. Um, and the course was trying to reframe this idea of the internet or information around certain thinkers who've talked about this, both in the 19th century and the 20th century, to sort of show that there's been a long history of people talking about a sort of crisis of meaning, right? Something like nihilism, um, and in particular, sort of a way that we can talk about the higher values of religion or sort of metaphysical truths or something, um, which I think very much gets us to Nietzsche, right? Um, Friedrich Nietzsche, who is sort of one of the first thinkers to really give it an articulation of what nihilism is. It's like a critique of modern European culture, right? Not as a like doctrine of saying, nothing matters and do whatever you want, which may be more a little bit like a Dostoevsky uh, version of this, there's no God, so all is permitted or something like that, right?
Hmm.
Um, but more as sort of like this disease, this like malaise that runs throughout the history of Western metaphysics that's led us to this point, and for him, the 19th century, where all of a sudden there's like no meaning anymore, right? And we have to deal with that.
Hmm.
Yeah, I actually, I was like, oh God, I gotta get prepared. I have the history of an error here. This is one of the only things that
Awesome.
I brought because you mentioned it. Yeah. But we could talk about it for sure.
Yeah, or why don't I think maybe even more? I think, well, most people are don't know the history of an error, but they do know Nietzsche for his very famous proclamation that God is dead.
Right.
And one of the things that I learned in your class was just how misinterpreted that statement was, and how
Yes.
um, um, you need to have a lot of context in terms of the goings on of the time, and honestly, how Nietzsche's brain worked, to understand what he's trying to do. Um, but however, that, so many people have erroneous perceptions of Nietzsche because of the infamous line, God is dead. So maybe we start with unpacking God is dead a little bit and then
Yeah,
reason through that
100%.
with history and error.
Yeah, I mean, and also, obviously, or I guess not obviously, but notoriously, to those who know, Nietzsche was also like, you know, his writings were sort of taken and repackaged and bastardized a little bit and used as philosophical underpinnings of the Nazi Party, right? It's another reason he's pretty misunderstood. For many, many
Mm-hmm.
years, people read Nietzsche or barely read Nietzsche, but if they did, they read him only as like the bad guy.
Mm-hmm.
And so that statement, God is dead, that is very famous. He did write it, right? God is dead and we have killed him. But it's a quote that he puts in the mouth of a character in an aphorism called the madman, right? And this is where, even then part of the context is so important. In his style of writing, he's not this systematic thinker who goes through these arguments, like you would have like Kant or, Locke or somebody that we're used to reading, like, okay, we're going to run through something and give you a treatise or posit these ideas. He writes aphoristically. He's kind of jumping into thoughts, and he has a title or a number, and it's a paragraph, maybe a couple pages, and he does this because he's trying to destabilize the idea of truth ultimately,
Mm-hmm.
right? And the
Mm-hmm.
way that philosophers think through difficult ideas, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's part of this method.
Mm-hmm.
You can't just read his writing and take it at face value, first of all.
Mm-hmm.
And that aphorism in particular is very metaphorical. So I don't have that one, right? But what happens is there's a madman. He comes into a town, like a European sort of very
Town,
social
yeah.
elite city, right? And he's
Mm-hmm.
talking about, these towns in Germany where you have all these fancy people going about who have all these newfangled ideas. They're dressed up all proper. They imagine themselves being the height of human civilization, right? This is coming after the Enlightenment. They're all um, these rationalists and these empiricists,
Mm-hmm.
these positivists, right, who think that
Mm-hmm.
we have control over truth and science to
Mm-hmm.
such a degree that we've captured, you know, we've tamed nature.
Reality,
It's yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Um, and and I don't know if you can hear my cat. My cat is
Yeah, it's
whining like crazy.
it's cute. Yeah.
Yeah, he doesn't usually do this. I don't know why he's. uh, but what's important for him in this setting is that these European sort of self-satisfied cultural elites, most of them or many of them have adopted this sort of rationalistic or sorry, not, naturalistic view of the world that doesn't have any
Mm-hmm.
room for God anymore, right? They're kind of,
Mm-hmm.
it's not quite atheism in the way that we understand. We might think of like deists, right? People who
Mm-hmm.
don't believe in the Christian God, but like this sort of clockmaker God or whatever. And so the madman comes in and he says, "Hey, haven't you heard? God is dead." Or like, where
Mm-hmm.
is God, right? And they're like, make fun of him. Like, "Oh, where'd God go? Did you lose him? Is it?" They're laughing at this madman. And he goes on this whole diatribe. He throws a lantern down on the ground. It shatters. And he says, you know, who have we who've dranken up the sea? The earth has been unchained from the sun and spins around in the cosmos. I'm paraphrasing. I don't remember exactly. I don't have a
Mm-hmm.
photographic memory. But the madman says all these things about how we are disoriented in the universe, right? We don't have
Mm-hmm.
a place, a stable place anymore from which we can have these ideas of truth or meaning. And what he's talking about specifically is this sort of Christian and Greek tradition that grounds truth and value and morality, right, and the meaning of our existence in this idea of God and sort of a rational, logical thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And he says that this has been sort of unmoored at this
Hmm.
point, and now we're like a ship that's lost at sea, and we have no sense of up or down or right or wrong, and everyone stares at the madman is like baffled, right?
Hmm.
This is, he says, God is dead. We're God's murderers, and you've all done it. And then he wanders off, and he's like, I come too early. You don't have ears for me,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and this is a classic Nietzsche move. Nietzsche believes this of himself, right? He says
Yeah.
he's writing and no one's reading him. Nobody cares about Nietzsche. He's sort of living this lonely, sick life, only has a couple friends, and writing all these books that don't really get published except for by his own, only a few copies are sold. He's like, nobody cares about me. So he sees himself as this sort of prophet, this
The
madman
madman.
who's
Yeah.
writing, and nobody has ears for him. Nobody can hear what he's trying to say, right? Um, but yeah, okay, that's a lot of paraphrasing of that aphorism. But how do we understand this? Like, God is dead. That's the question,
Hmm.
right?
That. Yeah. Yeah.
He's not saying that like there is no God, and that's what, like, I'm an atheist, and that's going to be my identity, and like now let's reclaim that as our identity.
Hmm.
He's saying to this sort of social cultural milieu on all these people that you have killed God with
Hmm.
your drive to truth, right? This
Yeah.
enlightenment critique of reason, this critique of metaphysics, um, this sort of disavowal of like traditional Christian ideas. He's like, you
Mm.
can say that we don't need Christian ideas anymore, or we're going to reject, this entire 2 millennia of
Hmm.
value systems, but that doesn't mean that they're not still there, and that they
Hmm.
don't still underpin the entire fabric of society. So if you cut that out, then all of a sudden you're taking out that very thing that grounds all of the value systems that we've had to date, right? The sense of morality, the sense of like what truth is, even as a
Hmm.
metaphysical idea,
Yeah.
right? And so he's like, look,
Capital T truth.
now,
Yeah.
yeah, now what do we do, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's cool. I mean, one of the things that I remember thinking is he approaches the statement in a "what have we done? What
Yes.
have we done? Like, how can we ever forgive ourselves for what we've done?" And he's very emotional in the writing. It's very compelling. It's a guy who's very distraught by the state of the universe. And I also read into it not just the social layer of the status seeking population that wants to assert their own status via portraying an image of knowing what truth is, but I think he stumbles into something really, really deep that is perhaps the pursuit of truth itself has this poisonous, trap in it. Um, and I think that's what History of an Error covers, right? Like I don't know how he does it, but he summarizes philosophy in 4 or 5 lines. Um,
Yeah.
and um, so I think that gives the backdrop to why he's so distraught. And I think it'd be awesome to go over with.
Yeah, I mean, we can like it really is true. One thing that we did also in the class, did we talk about like Pascal and a little bit,
We
or no?
did.
I
We
think we
talked
did, yeah,
about
right?
Descartes. We talked Pascal. We talked. Yeah, we did the whole works. We did all
I
of
know, it was
yeah, all of
crazy.
it. It was amazing.
One thing that I think is so compelling about Nietzsche as a thinker is that he's one of these figures in the history of thought who captures uh, the anxiety of the modern condition, right? In a way that feels very, very present to us. And there's a few people who I also point to who I think do that as well. And a few of them are even before Nietzsche. One of them would be Michel de Montaigne. And then after him, Pascal, Blaise Pascal. And these two also, in even the 16th and 17th centuries, when they're writing, are looking around the world and seeing that the sort of cozy, homogenous, safe understanding of like where the culture is and what truth is being sort of
Mhm.
dissolved by
Mhm.
a few things. One, like experience of other cultures, other people around. The
Mm,
world is getting smaller, right? We're starting to see in the age of exploration that there are other people who do completely different things, right? And also the natural sciences and mathematics, we're discovering that our place in the world isn't what it used to be. I mean, even the
mm,
Copernican revolution, the idea that we're not the center of the universe is a very, very big revelation. And so you have these thinkers who are like, what does this mean for us? And how does this affect our existence? And Nietzsche is part of that tradition, and I think even better than Pascal, really shows this emotional uh,
mhm,
anxiety in characters like the madman, like what you're talking
mhm,
about, and like the urgency of dealing with this problem,
mm,
right? In a way that people didn't quite understand at the time, and only now are we seeing like these issues that he's sort of presaging, like the problems of cultural relativism, right?
mhm,
Like, okay, what do we do if we don't say that there's any one truth that we can value, but we're still dealing with trying to figure out who's evil and who's not in the world, and like going to war, saving people or whatever, you
mhm.
anyway. um so this is he grounds this anxiety in like the history of metaphysics, and we don't have to like read through all of these, but just to sort of give an impression, right? He definitely
Mhm,
starts with Plato. And he says the true world, attainable for the wise, the devout, the virtuous, they live in it, they are it, right? What he's talking about here is with Plato. Plato is looking around the world that we live in, and he's saying, okay, this is not the true world. It's all an illusion, right? We can think
mhm,
the allegory of the cave, which most people
mhm,
in in our education system kind of come across at some point, right?
mhm,
The idea that we're like stuck and everything that we see and know is only like a shadow of actual
mhm.
reality. A better way culturally to understand this is essentially the Matrix, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Plato,
that's actually
yeah,
true. Yep.
Plato's allegory of the cave is basically the Matrix. Like,
Mhm.
here's the
Whoa.
world, but it's not the real world, and you have to escape it. And the only way
Mhm,
to escape it, unlike the Matrix, which is a different version, is through thought.
mhm.
And so
Contemplation and yeah.
yes, through speculation, right? Because we're such smart animals, right? Nietzsche calls us like, eccentric little animals. I love it.
Mhm,
We
mhm,
have this reason, and we can say, all right, all the things in the world, we only know them because they're approximations of these ideal forms, right?
mhm,
Um, and and so he's so what he does is he posits this real world, the true
mhm,
world, that we can only attain through thinking, right? Through speculation.
mhm,
That's the first moment or like, I think, put dramatically in this little aphorism, that is symbolically the first moment where we've made a mistake. This is the
mhm.
history of an error.
And
Um,
just to add some color, I think like when you say the real world, I think then that gets interpreted, and in the history of an era too, the real world is the divine,
yeah,
and it's the stuff that is beyond what our perceptual abilities, but it's the real deal that informs who we are. But it exists in this plane that is inaccessible to us on the reg, right?
yeah, and so the title of this, the history of an error is like the subtitle, but it's how the true world finally became a fiction. And so he's really telling this story of how we started with this idea in Western thought that is a foundation for all of Western culture,
Mhm,
Greek thought and the Bible,
mhm,
essentially, right? Um, that you posit a true world, and then over the course of Western culture, that true world becomes a fiction. And so he moves from Plato, right, and he goes through a few of them, but the main thing to think about is what happens on the way to Kant.
mhm.
And what's going on is that if you posit this true world of ideal forms where you can really know something like justice or truth or love, you
Beauty.
find out what the actual beauty exactly, right? Um, those get taken over by the Christian tradition, and they are melded into the idea of God, right?
Hmm.
Where God finally is the thing that the real, very real entity that sort of grounds all of existence otherwise. And everything that we know in reality emanates from God. And everything is real only insofar as God has made it real, which is true for truth, which is true for our existence, right? For our souls and our spirits, for the idea of right and wrong. You get this combination of the revelation through the testaments, right? The Hebrew Bible and the Christian Bible that say God has handed down these commandments and God is telling us how to live. You get like a melding of that with Greek thought that sort of grounds it in this rational tradition.
Hmm.
Um, and then Kant comes along. Where's the Kant one,
Hmm.
right? The true
It's
world,
the yeah.
unattainable, unprovable, unpromisable, but a consolation, an obligation, an imperative, merely by virtue of being thought. And I love his little
Mm.
parentheticals here. The old sun, basically, but glimpsed through the fog and skepticism. The idea becomes sublime, pallid, Nordic, Königsbergian, right?
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, yeah,
Kant, the great Enlightenment thinker from Königsberg in Prussia. He he's saying here that finally, after hundreds of years in the Enlightenment, we question the validity of metaphysical truth, right?
yeah. Hmm.
We're questioning how we know things and actually know them in a scientific way, how we ground knowledge so that we can pursue uh, these more practical sciences of understanding the world empirically around us, right? Understanding the laws of physics, making advancements technologically, and we have to get rid of these traditional views of the world in order to make space for that. And Kant is part of this project where it says like we can't hold on to these metaphysical claims about the nature of reality anymore. And he does this through his work. It's most famously presented in his Critique of Pure Reason, where he basically says, like, look, here's what knowledge is. Knowledge is a combination of sense perception, right, and cognition. So in our brains, we have these categories of understanding, right? Things like space, extension, time, sequencing, right? And that's how we understand the world. That's how we make rational thought. But that doesn't happen in a vacuum. We need sense perception. We need experience in order to
Hmm.
make that. So, very simply, inputs get in, things like vision, touch, regular experience. Our brain organizes it, and from that we get knowledge, like
Hmm.
erkenntnis, right? And the thing about that is that if that's what real knowledge is, and it requires sense perception, then you can't have real knowledge about things we don't have any sense perception about, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
If you don't have experience of something, then it doesn't count as valid knowledge.
Hmm. Hmm.
And of course, if you don't have experience of the divine or metaphysical realms, right? Um, which is part of the tradition. Plato says, right, like there's the only way to attain these
Oh,
things is through speculation, right?
yeah.
Then all of a sudden metaphysical speculation no longer counts as valid
Mm.
reason, valid knowledge.
Hmm.
And
Like
so,
thinking on the nature of God is pointless. Is who are we to
yeah,
pretend to know these things that are completely outside of our matrix? You know.
yeah, and he goes through the entire history of like ontological, cosmological, teleological proofs of God, these things that have been part of the Christian tradition, through the Greek rationalistic thought for hundreds of
Hmm.
years, right? And
Hmm.
he destroys them. It's just,
Hmm.
he
Hmm.
says, okay, here's Enlightenment thought, and I'm going to go through all of Western metaphysical speculation and just show you one after the other how it doesn't count, right? So he undercuts our
Hmm.
ability to have access to that sort of truth,
Hmm.
right? In Nietzsche's framing, the true world of
Hmm.
Plato becomes the supernatural, right?
Yeah.
Metaphysical, meta
Mm,
meaning over, physical coming from physis, nature, translated into Latin is supernatural. So we have to understand
mm,
that in Kant, we're getting the expression that metaphysical truth is just supernatural fantasy,
mm,
right?
mm.
And
And in a
we
world that's
understand now,
yeah,
yeah, if you're living in a naturalistic world, which we all
yeah.
do, right? How we understand our place in the universe is naturalism, generally speaking, right?
Mm,
Or historically, how we explain uh, what things are is
mm,
naturalism, right? We don't answer the question of through history how we came to
right,
be or what things are by accounting for like miracles. That doesn't count.
right.
Um, so that's all part of like this naturalistic framework. But Nietzsche's like, look, you now we have both. We have a society that's based off of the idea that the true world is not this world, a rejection of the world around us as illusory.
Mm,
And then we also now have this entire culture that has rejected that true world as illusory. And so now both worlds are illusory and we're caught in the middle.
mm-hmm,
The world
mm-hmm,
around us is not good enough, right? Because it's
mm-hmm.
not divine, it's flawed, it's just flesh and lust and mud
Meaningless. Yeah,
and
yeah.
dirt. Yeah. And we need God to provide meaning for it. But now we don't have any way to get to that meaning that God has
Mm,
provided for us. And so this is what he means, the madmen, when we're like a ship lost at sea, right? We're
mm-hmm,
unmoored from any safe haven. We don't have the real world anymore. It's illusory, it's a fiction. And we don't have metaphysical truth anymore, which is also illusory or fiction. And what do we do
mm.
with that?
Right. Um, and I remember also there was in the story there was a bit of an arc where Plato proposes a bridge to the divine through thought. Then it becomes institutionalized into Christianity, and it gets sort of let's say bureaucratized. That the real guarantee is you can cross the bridge in death. And then Kant shows up and says, "Nope, not even in death." And
Yeah,
then the Romantics come around, and the Romantics say, "Well, then what's the point of it all anyway?" And then sever the bridge entirely, and we're left with complete, adrift. Um,
yeah,
and
yeah. I mean, the bridge is a great way to think about it because you know that actually gets at that really important aspect of how Christianity took on the ideas that come from Plato and Aristotle, right? Where it's
mhm,
like, okay, here I am as an individual soul. How do I have meaning in this life? Well, obviously the Bibles have given us meaning through telling us how we should live and what we should do, and like positioning our soul in this sort of divine struggle between good and evil. I mean, that's not exactly
mhm,
Christian theology, but
mhm,
that this is the way that a lot of us, live thinking about this, where it's like, I'm either going to go to heaven or hell, and the bridge to that is the way that we ground our meaning in life, right?
right,
Um,
right.
yeah.
And even like the official title for the Pope is the Pontifex, um,
Hmm.
which is how just a display of how deeply institutionalized these concepts became. And I think, well,
And this,
go for it.
well, I was just going to say, I mean, this is an aside, but we can't underestimate the influence of the Protestant Reformation in this regard, right? Like
Oh, absolutely.
this is in the 1500s, right? We're coming around and saying like, no, we don't need the Pope. Screw the
Hmm.
Pope. Luther says we can do this on our own. Here I stand, right? Me alone in the face of God. I don't need your mediation. My soul isn't going to have the Pope holding my hand when I'm standing before God. So we have the responsibility ourselves, which is actually quite a lonely thing,
Oh yeah.
you know. it's
Oh
it's
yeah.
like very anxiety inducing, and that's part of the anxiety that we get in the modern era.
Hmm. Oh yeah. The task of building meaning is now ours. We have to become Pope and God and Jesus and all cultures at the same time. And but I think there's something. I think this is a great launching off point. What you just mentioned about the Protestant Reformation to start talking about how information as we understand it today, has started to meddle with these themes. Because I think the Protestant Reformation is so tightly linked to the printing press, in terms of and the printing press and the bootleg translations of the Bible that were only
Bootleg. I love that.
it's exactly what it was. I mean, it was like, shh, don't, at Oxford, they're like, oh, shh,
Yeah,
you know?
yeah,
But something really weird happens there that I think is like, um, you come from a highly bureaucratized institution that is uh, filled with gatekeepers who know the language, who know sorry, quote unquote, know the language, quote unquote, know the true meaning of these symbols and myths and stories. And when you Prometheus, you steal the fire from the gods, and you start adapting, it's translating not only through time but also across culture.
yeah.
Then you start to be in a position where, okay, in information, purely information domain, there's more transfer of information, but you're not sure if you're capturing all the layers of meaning and all the layers of understanding that might have been, we don't know, but might have been um, more ritualized in the perfect, the glass enclosure that it was in.
Yeah, I think you're right in terms of the Protestant Reformation being like a central point here. One thing that's so clear in that moment in history is that you cannot think about the shift in ideas without thinking about how they're deeply embedded in material history, right? And technology. That's
Mm,
like everything that we experience in terms of like that Lutheran anxiety about the soul, unmediated by the Catholic Church, right,
mm,
has to do with the way that technology was made um, that position available to a broad group of people, right?
mm,
Without, like, yes, Luther translated the Bible into German, and so then people could finally read it, right? It was only in Latin before that, and only the people who know Latin could read it, which was very few. Most people didn't speak the language, and so they were just being told what it meant, right? They relied on others. So he translated the Bible into to German, but if the printing press hadn't been invented, then nobody would have gotten it either, right? You need both, and they both
mhm,
happened at the same time. And so then all of a sudden you have the Gutenberg Bible, right?
mhm,
And with the Gutenberg Bible, that bootleg version, that then
mhm,
these ideas proliferate, right?
mhm.
And this is like if we're thinking about like information theory, you eventually get to the idea that Dawkins has of like the meme, right? This idea
Oh
that
yeah.
that uh, information just proliferates. That's what it does, right? And he's talking about this in the context of genetics, where he says that
Mhm,
it's a mistake to think that evolution is based off of animals getting better and better at surviving or something like that, and this like teleological process from the more simple to like the more evolved, meaning advanced. We
mhm,
think of like, oh, you're highly evolved as being like better,
mhm,
and he comes around and he's saying like, no, that's not quite it, right? It's that there are entity or organisms that are more successful at proliferating the information contained in the genes. That's the
mhm,
whole point.
mhm,
Genes are, they want to, you know, get their information spread as widely as possible. And so a meme is like the cultural equivalent of this, right?
mhm.
Um, and the material history of technological advances makes it possible for the memes of things like nihilism or
Mhm.
atheism to sort of spread,
Mhm.
you know?
And at increasing orders of magnitude.
Exactly.
So there's, you could we could go over, but I don't even know if it's worth it. The categorical jumps that happen through the telegraph, the telephone, the postal service. I remember we read. The Information by James
Yeah,
Gleek.
yeah,
And I mean, just the history of the dictionary. It's just
yeah.
incredible. I mean, all these
That book is
things that were
amazing.
that book is so good. It's one of my
Yeah.
all-time favorites. There's so many good quotes, but just there's two cool things there that maybe we could touch on. That there's a
Hmm.
force that we didn't really explore in the class. That is, in the story of the dictionary, there were these hubs of people who were negotiating the spellings of different words, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so there appears to be in the meme spreading mechanism a sort of a sync process, a dialectical we're talking about the definition of a word, and we're calibrating our meaning compasses to align to share the meaning of the word. Um, Word, myth, story, disposition toward nature. And it feels like even that process has gone out of control, where like the rate of the spread of the memes is faster than our ability to sync up around them. Uh,
Yeah, no, actually I haven't really thought about it in this context, but if you're thinking about this sort of dissolution of stable meaning, right? th- in the past, with a smaller group, a smaller like set of material documentation of what things are, it was easier to have stable meaning, right?
mhm.
Obviously, organically, language was very diffuse, right? But the sort of ways that we sort of tried to harness that at least could be contained. But then
Mm.
as you get more and more, Gleek talks about information as a flood. Finally, right? It's just
Yeah, yeah,
you
yeah.
can't control it, right? Um, it's there. It's impossible to harness. Not only
Hmm.
is language then organic on the surface, things changing and shifting faster than anybody can control, but also materially speaking, there's no way to harness it. All the dictionaries can do is like try to keep up, right? We're just adding
Yeah,
words constantly. That's all. That's all we do,
yeah,
and it's like we're no longer being prescriptivists. We're just describing, right?
yeah, totally. Um, well, I was just reminded of Urban Dictionary. The most
Hmm.
reliable source of to understand what the kids are saying these days. But there's And I think maybe this is a good chance to segue more into the other side of the contradiction that we're faced with today. That is, even though we understand the world through information theory, and we are in the information age, and sort of we've unlocked the ability to have this conversation. I mean, like it truly is incredible materially,
Hmm.
but it doesn't really hide the fact that there's something spooky about information. I mean,
Yeah.
information per se is a string of bytes. It's a series of electrons that is organized in some way, but has value that depends on the interpreting function of said data.
Yeah.
And that is completely neglected. That is, I don't know that discourse has found any way to enter let's call it the mainstream or the church of science. Um,
Yeah. There's like, if there are zeros and ones, and we're talking about information essentially as like the introduction of difference, disambiguation, right?
yep,
So that we can create meaning,
yep,
there is a sort of skipping over that step where like, no, we still have to interpret it, right? Like
right.
if you have data, then there's still the need to interpret the data, right? And I think that's sort of the part that even in the 1860s, the 1880s, Nietzsche was saying like, hey, you all think that our knowledge, our scientific knowledge is so grounded, it's so true. But this idea of capital T truth that you're assigning to um, this self-satisfied way of understanding the world naturalistically that's giving us all these practical inventions, everything like that.
Hmm.
That capital T truth is borrowed from the metaphysical speculation that we no longer have access to. And
Mm.
right,
Mm.
that's the only thing in the history of ideas that has been like, this is the really real, the true is God, or
OG. Yeah.
yeah, or Plato's good. But once we don't have that, yes, we have the practical application of the sciences, but we're making the mistake of assigning like the real true value to these things. And he's
Mm.
pointing at positivists, he's pointing at empiricists,
Mm.
people who are looking around culture, especially social critics, right?
Mm.
People who like ethicists and things like that, who say like, okay, this is what morality is, what being good is. I mean, people are studying religion, let's say for instance, right, and say like,
Mm.
oh, I'm going to anthropologically go around the world that is all of a sudden so small we can go everywhere,
Mm.
study these other cultures, and I can tell you exactly what the origins of religion are, like what the origins of,
Mm.
society are.
Mm.
And this is now fact, this is truth. And he's like, there's no such thing as facts or truth,
Mm.
because that relies on this mode of thinking metaphysically that you yourselves
Yeah, it's
have
you're
undercut.
invalidating it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
And I think so. That's like this, what you're talking about, today in the zeitgeist, where we're looking around in the church of science. Uh, when we pray to that church, we sort of forget that the science is very ephemeral in terms of,
mm.
or in flux in terms of how we can
Mm.
treat that as like solid information or truth.
By the core mythology of the history of science itself, that the science
Yeah.
is always changing, that, there's the lone scientist who figures out something and nobody listens to them, and like they have to fight their entire lives. They probably die in poverty or get prosecuted, and then, only years after do we realize they were right all along, right? Like that's the history
Yeah.
of science. Yet somehow we're supposed to exempt that myth from analyzing science today.
Yeah, and I do want to say that if you talk to any, like, self-respecting scientists, professional, it's certainly like professional academics or researchers, right?
Mm.
They're not going to tell you that what science is doing is getting at stable truth, right? Because
Hmm.
science is a method of hypothesis, and it's
Yeah.
only true insofar as it hasn't yet been proven wrong, right?
Right.
So, yes, one could make the argument that we do have baked into the myth of science this idea that it's all sort of trials, it's all attempts.
Mm.
However, and this is where what Nietzsche recognizes, and what I think we fail to really unpack, that still exists in a dialectic. It still is a
Mm.
teleological process for us. Like, yes, we may not have the truth now, but if science works correctly, which it does, we all,
Yeah, yeah.
think, we go from being less right about the world, right? How we thought about it before, the earth is flat, we're the center of the
Hmm.
universe, to getting more and more right about the state of things, actually. And that will continue forever. It's this idea of progress,
Right.
of
Yeah, yeah.
evolution as advancement. And Kant shows us that is a practical idea. It is not a metaphysical truth.
Right.
And so that sort of ideal end of being like actually real
Mm.
is something that for Nietzsche is a myth, is a fantasy. And where that really comes into play for us, I think, and this is where we get into like questions of science fiction and everything like that,
Hmm.
like we have these conceptions of society and civilization, and we are very comfortable with the idea of saying, okay, we started there and that was rough. You get like
Hmm.
Hobbes or something, life is
Yeah.
brutish, violent, and short, right? And now things are better, so obviously
Hmm.
science is working, right? Look around us.
Yeah. Yeah.
um, but is it better or is it just different? How have our problems changed? Are they gone, right?
Mm.
Maybe we're more comfortable. If we continue in this trajectory, is it going to continue getting better? Or will our means of existence sort of destroy the world? Or will we
Right.
create the entities that will finally, murder us, right, and take over?
Hmm.
These are very real questions that we're dealing with,
Yeah.
obviously. And so
Oh,
you can no
yeah.
longer be so self-satisfied.
Right. No, no, no. I mean, like this. Oh, I mean, even when we took the class, close to 7 years ago, that was, a hypothetical scenario. That was you. You could access it via. fiction, and you could access it via these like prophetic works that try to project out the course that we were charting and see, okay, this is where you're going to end up. 7 years later, we're right around the corner. I mean,
Yeah.
I've been in a dialogue with ChatGPT for, I don't know, close to 6 months now, for 6 hours a day, and let me tell you, there's spooky stuff going on there. I mean,
Yeah.
I even just in like, I'm not, no claims about the the generality of its intelligence, but even just the self-reflection of what it informs me about my own cognition. Like, oh,
Yeah.
you can't do that, but this is what I'm doing. So, oh, this is the machinery that's in my brain. Uh,
Yeah.
and and I don't know. Do you feel? I feel this really strange sense of optimism for AI in particular. I don't know if we want to go into AI, but I think I've shifted my perspective around them. Kind of like saying the Kantian um, convenient fiction of holding on to this optimism, because I think in general the the feeling of the unmoored ship, on top of also projecting a category 5 hurricane that's coming our way, we could solve one or the other, but I don't know if we can solve both. And it's easier for me to imagine a world in which the category 5 hurricane, you can divert the efforts against the category 5 or hurricane, but it's much harder to imagine what the solution is for the ship on board. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm trying to follow the metaphor here. The unmoored ship is like something about like our existence and like how we ground our own meaning, sort of where we're
Yeah,
sort of
yeah,
caught
man.
in the middle there. And then the hurricane being like the actual physical dangers to our world.
Well, yeah, it's the nuclear war,
Yeah.
AI, climate,
Yeah, I think that that has to be right. Like we can, with whatever technology we have or whatever civilization societies we're building, we can try to solve the problems that come our way in terms of these crises, right? Natural disasters or even war. But I think the whole point of the modern or postmodern condition, which is captured even in, like I said, the 16th century, all the way
hmm
to Nietzsche and to us, that's not something that we can really reverse unless there's some
hmm
real collapse or shift in society,
hmm
culturally speaking, right? We're not going to go back to a point where um, there's stable meaning anymore, and any attempt to do that actually takes on a quite spooky characteristic, like
hmm
you said. And this also goes to um, the idea of technology and information, right? What does it look like nowadays when people try to, in the modern era, try to say, like, no, we do have stable truth? It ends up being, generally speaking, fundamentalism, right?
Yeah.
Where where we have people who are like, okay, I have all this information, and the only thing that I can do is double down on the idea that that is really, 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 really true, right? And you're
Mm.
like,
Yeah.
how do you prove that? Well, I can't. God made it that way. And you're like, well, how do you account for like translations of holy texts and all that stuff? Like, don't worry about it. If
hmm
English is good enough for the Bible, it's good enough for me.
hmm
Um, and so the brand of trying to bring the ship back to harbor in the modern era is quite problematic, right? And
Yeah.
quite polarizing.
Yeah.
Uh, and I think that's the only way that it can be, because otherwise you're faced with this anxiety.
Yeah, no, 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 and I agree. And I've been thinking about the ships on moored as we think we're in one ship that is lost, but everybody's in their own ship. And I think like we could get a lot of mileage out of just holding hands, like and be like, okay, one node of the graph to another node of the graph, we share. we start building a foundational understanding of like these are the the things that I'm going to assume that are true, even though we may not have proof of it. And this is what we do in society all the time, right? Like I assume that we're
Yeah.
going to have a yeah
Well, and I think that speaks to like the optimistic view of the internet as a place where we get like the great equalizer or the great
yeah
democratization of knowledge,
yeah
right? The problem with that is, as we've seen, certainly in our country, but also like elsewhere in the world, the democratization of knowledge or information, right, does not automatically equal social progress. At least
yep
to those of us, actually, it foments social discord because you don't,
mm,
you know, just because everyone has access now to the same information doesn't mean that, as we had hoped, I think at one point, that then everybody will just become more enlightened. Actually, you
hmm
get these silos, you get these echo chambers, and the internet, the proliferation of information also allows for this sort of entrenchment of
yeah
uh, radicalized thinking. And
yeah
so,
yeah
yes,
and
on the one hand,
manipulation and
maybe
yeah
yeah, I think the idea that we can all sort of hold hands now because we're all interconnected in a way that we've never been before is part of that um, hopeful thinking of what this information technology will allow for us. Um, I'm not. I mean, just dispositionally, of course. I mean, you may gather this already. I'm certainly much more Nietzschean. I don't have. I have a hard time being optimistic about these things, about AI or about about our ability to do that. I don't have the faith for it.
Mm.
You know?
um, yeah, no, I think that I think that actually I want to add a little thing that, one of the things we talked about in class was Kierkegaard's leveling and how once you have this flood of information, the onus of telling apart truth from fiction falls on everybody, but then you get just completely overwhelmed and it all feels the same.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
um and so and I think that's another of the downsides of the internet is like we're hit with so many pieces of information, and I think now it's become very apparent that we cannot trust any of it.
yeah,
Like I am incredibly like I just don't know what to believe in anymore. I Twitter. I hang out on Twitter because I get something out of it, but I'm like I don't know how much of this is true. The news, how much of it is true? I don't know. And
yeah,
it reveals this really scary concept, which is just echoing the themes that we've been talking about. That um, we don't know what the chain of um, myths upon myths upon myths upon myths that inform our current global decision making, or even our personal local decision making. Um, and we now know that there have been forces, and I don't mean the anthropomorphized. There have been just like natural entropic forces that distort the message as it hops from one node to another. And so
yeah,
when we're in charge of making a rational decision, then it just becomes incredibly terrifying to know that you're operating on this massive space of uncertainty.
yeah.
Um,
You know, to reframe Nietzsche's history of an error in light of this, right? Skepticism is not just a product of the modern age, right? Like,
oh
yes, we can
no,
think of it that way, but actually, skepticism is what grounds the entire scientific method, right?
yeah,
What is a scientific method except for questioning things, analyzing them to try to figure out what they are beyond what we see, right?
right.
And so this is what Plato does. He's skeptical about the world around us as being true, and so he posits truth. And then you get it's this idea that you are
Mm,
first and foremost skeptical about everything, and that leads you to some sort of higher truth that Nietzsche traces through the history of thought, until you're left with no higher truth and just skepticism. And that's what we're kind of talking about now, right? Where
mhm,
we are faced with the need to decide for ourselves at every point and all around us what is true. And this is why for both Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, the act of philosophizing is or like making this stance is one of extreme courage, and bravery,
Mm.
right? It's a very,
Oh
very
yeah.
difficult thing. You have to sort of be a knight of faith. Kierkegaard has in one of his characters writing, or for Nietzsche, the philosopher philosophizes with a hammer, right? You don't
Oh
come
yeah.
to make
Yeah.
yourself comfortable. You actually have to come to destroy, and you have to be able to sit with uncomfortable truths or uncomfortable thoughts, and you have to hold them together, right? Like we contain
Yeah.
multitudes and contradictions. That sort of mentality, and most people, for both of them, don't have the strength for it. And
Yeah.
that's
Most
the
people
that's
get.
that's
Yeah.
the leveling. That's the
Yeah.
leveling, right? Where we all kind of say, and this is where what Kierkegaard said, and Heidegger after him, that truth is what they say, right? They say that
Mm.
Halley's comet is coming back and it's going to hit the Earth, right? They say that this is how the world actually works, right? But the they is no longer anyone,
Mm.
and it's
Mm.
just gets deferred, right? Like every
Hmm.
single person is deferring to they, and we're not thinking for ourselves, right? And that's the thing that we all sort of rely on in order to keep ourselves comfortable and not suicidal.
No, and it's and I think like it's even crazier that as you say go from, let's say, a piece of information that is not within my area of expertise, I delegate that thinking to somebody who I think is more proximal. They delegate to something who they think is more proximal. And you get to the point where um, by the time it makes it to the people who are actual experts, the stakes are so high, and they have
Yeah,
such a degree of imposter syndrome that they are also in a position where they're delegating to the sort of the Ouija board of academic politics to
yeah.
negotiate what the right interpretation is, which is not necessarily aligned, or we don't have any guarantees that it's aligned with actual reading or actual interpretation, right?
There's also a problem that Nietzsche diagnoses quite well too, where like in the workshop of knowledge, he looks at, you go down the philosopher goes down into the workshop of ideas, sort of this underground like lair, and he's like, oh God, it stinks down here, bad air. He says it's really funny. He's ridiculous. But what you find there are these little disformed, like sort of goblin men, right?
Mm,
Who are so weak and impoverished, except for one thing: they have a giant ear or they have a giant nose, right? Their whole
mm,
existence is this sort of um, grotesque overgrowth of one aspect. And what he's talking about here is this sort of the expertise, right? Those experts who are
mhm.
finally at the highest in order to be an expert now, because of how overwhelming information and knowledge is. And this is something that it was easier to know everything about the world
Yeah.
when you were Aristotle than it is now. There was less to
Yeah.
know, right? A brain could contain it in a
Yeah.
certain way. Now you have to ignore everything else except for one small problem. And that's
Yeah.
the myth of like what we do in academia or researchers, right? You have this whole big problem, but all we do is push one little corner of it. We advance one little part, and then
Mm,
we have the faith that the whole thing will eventually advance all together, right? But
mhm,
when we go ask those experts at the very, very top, okay, so how does this help us get a better life? Or how does
mhm.
this help us solve these big moral questions? They're like, I don't know, I'm not a moralist. I'm trying to solve the problem of whether or not this atom has 3 or 5
17 or 18.
electrons,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
yeah, you know. And so you really get to a point where like it's cheesy, but it's like the Superman problem, right? And Lois Lane, where it's like, I've got you, and she's like, well, who's got you? That's where we all are, right?
Mhm, mhm.
We're like, who actually who actually is dealing with the problem of whether or not we should be creating AI? Who's actually dealing with the
Right.
question of whether or not our society is progressing to a place that will help more people or not? The people who are thinking about this are science fiction authors, right? Who are like, hey,
Yeah.
I'm feeling helpless, so let me imagine where we might be going, either as
Yeah.
utopia or dystopia, right? And maybe
Yeah.
that will help you think about it at least.
Yeah.
But the
Um,
experts aren't doing it.
And because I think also like we've almost made it taboo for any institution to self-proclaim moral authority. Um,
Hmm.
like I think, well, I don't think the I want to separate science from academia, but I don't think that academia
Yeah,
as a collective institution has any moral claim to moral authority. I mean, it's just not even
yeah.
in the unless it were integrated at the core. I mean, like there's ways to imagine it being that way, but I don't think in its current configuration it is that way.
There's, I think, two things to say about that. On the one hand, absolutely, right? And this, we talk about this a lot in my religious studies classes, where, religious studies is a really interesting field for this reason in particular, because what
Mm,
you're doing is from a naturalistic social science perspective, anthropology, sociology, ethnography, like whatever you're doing,
mm,
right? History is studying a a vast array of faith claims, beliefs in the world, or rituals or ways of like creating meaning in life, and a lot of those involve statements of truth. This is the way the
hmm
universe is, right? But from a naturalistic perspective, what we do is sort of bracket the question of whether or not any of those one things is true, and try to understand it in a like objective way, right?
mm,
And so, yes, baked into the very method of like a naturalistic social science, you
mm,
have a bracketing of any metaphysical claim to sort of this higher truth, which includes moral truth. So
mm.
that is like the idea of cultural relativism is baked into academia, right? Like, okay, here's
Right.
this tribe somewhere that hasn't been touched by modern civilization. People thought like this, especially a lot in like the 19th century, right? Um, but we're not going to say whether or not they're bad. We're going to sort of preserve
hmm
them, or like it's not for us to say. Of course, in the back of our
Right.
minds, they're like we're better, right?
Yeah,
Um, yeah, but the other thing to say is that also baked into academia is a liberal social progressivism, right? Is
yeah. That's true. Yeah.
this myth of progress, where it's like if we continue
Mm.
to do this, then the spread of knowledge, the spread of this rationalistic thinking, the empirical study of
Material.
the
Yeah.
world around, yeah, will eventually lead to more enlightened people, which will lead to a better society, right? And this is
Mm,
why the radical right in this country is so skeptical of the liberal left, right? The sort
hmm
of like ivory tower, uh, you know, people who are in
Yeah.
charge of all knowledge, but who haven't worked an honest day in their life, right?
hmm
Um,
hmm
this is it's a really interesting, strange thing that's happened with like anti-intellectualism and how it's become this
Oh
sort of
yeah.
radicalized conservative approach, right? Uh, and that really casts a light on the fact that the myth of progress in academia is a moral claim, right? It is a moral
Mm,
claim. It's a claim of moral superiority that this if we keep doing this, then we are the right way.
yeah. Yep, and it's hard to say immediately how falsifiable or unfalsifiable that moral claim is, right? Um,
Yeah,
I mean, like
yeah, and
you
it's
could,
also highly
yeah.
problematic because
Oh, highly
obviously there's a lot
problematic,
of
yeah.
power structures and institutionalized knowledge production, right?
hmm
Um, that we know from like racism and all sorts of other classism,
Oh, well, so
all
many.
sorts of issues, right? Where um, the liberal pursuit of knowledge as a sort of evolutionary act
hmm
that will lead people to freedom, right? Truth is freedom, right?
hmm
Uh, truth is power. You get that
hmm
by maintaining these systems that
Yeah,
give people who pursue truth quite a lot of power
yeah,
and
yeah. Oh,
a
totally.
very good deal of social prestige.
Yeah. Kevin, we're about an hour and four. I want to be super mindful of your time. Maybe we
Yeah,
close with,
yeah. Let's have a sort of wrapping up discussion. What are you
Awesome.
thinking?
I'm thinking, I want to know what's on your mind these days. I want to know how you're grappling with these questions in present day. We haven't chatted in 7 years now, so I wanted to know like what you're up to, what are you reading, what are you excited about, what are you terrified
Yeah.
about?
Oh man, so many things. No, in the time that when was our class? What year was it?
That was 2016.
Okay, so I already had. I thought so. Yeah, I mean, obviously, a big part of the last 7 years have been being a parent and navigating
Oh,
finishing
congrats.
my doctorate in there. I think that my son was born in 2014, so I was a new parent at that time. But now I have a 9-year-old and a 6-year-old, and so that's been a crazy adventure. And only recently, in the last 2.5 years, have I been also teaching again. So now I'm a
Hmm.
professor at Santa Clara, which has been
Hmm.
really great to be back in this world of ideas. And my my classes have been phenomenal because they've really been digging into this question of like religious studies. I teach these like
Hmm.
theories and methods courses that are talking about
Hmm.
a lot about some of the things I was just mentioning, right?
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, I really have still been very fascinated from like my own work and the things that I'm excited about writing on with these questions of science fiction. I mean, I haven't let go. That's why that course was so special for me, because it was sort of this first start in building a theoretical framework for a really serious analysis of like what we're doing when we're um, projecting through literature, through the arts,
Hmm.
forward into the future, right? What that sort of imaginative project is. Um, and yeah, I'm currently sort of working on a project that is using the philosophy of a thinker named Paul Ricoeur, who I
Hmm.
wrote my dissertation on, who writes a lot about language and these ideas, like ideas of metaphor, sort of really dovetailing nicely with Latour, the rejoicing,
Hmm.
the
Great stuff.
torments of religious speech that we were talking about in class. Um, Using his thinking to talk about utopia and dystopia, and the way that
Yeah.
ideology goes into the myths that we create in science fiction, and how science fiction gives us a way to process the difficulties, the existential questions that we are
Mm.
faced with in the modern age, right? Um,
Oh yeah. I mean, um, and I think the fact that you are, let me see if I can extract my reading of it, but there's something special about, or perhaps inevitable about the fact that these truths are coming from fiction. That you need the veil of, I'm not trying to tell you how it is. Don't worry about it. We're just gonna have a good time. But in the meantime, if you this reveals anything to you, if you extract meaning out of it that you think is true and valuable, good on you. But I'm not going to be in a position to tell you how it is. I'm just going to play around. That's sort of the meta veil that has, I think, crystallized in my mind.
yeah, one of the reasons why I really love Ricoeur's thought is because he's coming out of a tradition that is reframing the way that we understand truth in terms of meaning, right? In terms of
Mm.
interpretation. I think that we may have gotten into phenomenology a little bit in
Yeah,
the
we did.
class. Yeah,
Heidegger,
yeah,
the river and the
exactly.
power plant. Yeah.
Yeah, and when what Ricoeur is doing is really fascinating, because he talks about how when you have something like metaphor or fiction, or even just the question of like a reader reading a text, right?
Hmm.
There is something that happens in imagination that opens up a new realm of reality, right? That is
Hmm.
actually a true reality. In
Hmm.
fact, if
Hmm.
everything around us is interpreted and is some sort of like, something that we need to make sense of, that we need to make meaningful for ourselves, then any form of meaning has a validity. And so
Mm.
scientific truth is one mode of discourse, But
Hmm.
narrative or poetic or fictional truth is equally valid as a way of thinking about reality, right? One is
Hmm.
not higher than the other because we no
Hmm.
longer have that hierarchy of reality
Value,
that we get
truth.
from
Yeah, yeah.
a theo-ontological, framework of the universe where God stands at the
Hmm.
top as the most real and we stand at the bottom as like the most illusory. Now
Hmm.
everything is level, but what that means is when you're reading science fiction, there is a creation of possible worlds in your
Hmm.
mind through imagination where you're presented and you sort of confront creatively the mind of somebody else or the writing of
Hmm.
somebody else, and when you create a world out of that, that is a new uh, metaphysical reality. It is a new
Hmm.
ontological creation of meaning, and it's
Hmm.
only through that that we can shift thinking, right?
Hmm.
Um, that we can recreate the world around us. I mean, he really
Hmm.
is Nietzsche's claim to how we can get out of the problem of nihilism. Uh,
Hmm.
he has the myth of the eternal return or something else, but
The recurrence, yeah.
really, yeah, that's a thought experiment
Yeah.
ultimately. But what he says over and over again is that we need a transvaluation of all value, a
Mm.
revaluation of all value. We have to have
Mm.
somebody who has a strength to um, overhaul the entire system of what something of value means or what like morality means. And that was complicated for him and obviously got appropriated by the Nazis in a really problematic way, a troubling way, but whatever. But for Ricoeur, what this means is that we can sort of accept our position as always creating meaning in this deeply poetic act, whether it's
Hmm.
science or whether it's fiction,
Hmm.
and through that really transform
Hmm.
things. It's a transformative project along with just like an
Mm.
imaginative project, right? Um, he has a very practical application of these things, which is really fascinating to me.
Hmm.
So yeah, I think
I'm
that
excited.
science
Is
fiction
his?
is transformative.
I agree. It's changed my life. I mean, like, I don't
Yeah.
think I'd be the person I am without science fiction. Like getting involved in the intellectual pursuits that I did, developing some of the relationships that I did, it absolutely shifted my understanding of the world. Is his reading? How would you categorize his reading him? Is it a sort of an intellectual endeavor? Is it an easy read? Is it a
No, he's. I mean, he's a very like he's a philosopher, and he
like
is
Latour,
certainly
vibes, or
um what we read from Latour is a very different piece of writing from most of Latour's
true,
work.
true, yeah.
So probably not like that. But I will say, as a philosopher, Ricoeur is quite easy to read. So
Mm,
a sort of qualifying the fact that yes, he's a very welcoming and easy thinker to get into as long as you're pretty well versed in the history of
mm.
philosophy. Um, he's not Heidegger. He's not Hegel, right?
Oh,
He's
yeah,
not
yeah,
Kant. Like,
yeah, yeah.
he's not famously difficult or impossible to read. He
Mhm.
definitely is writing in such a way that he wants his readers to understand, and for that reason, he's a really wonderful person to read. And
Awesome.
he writes about a massive array of topics. And so you can kind of dabble here or there in a lot of his work is in essays, shorter essays, rather than
Mm.
like long
Mm.
monographs. And so he is quite accessible in that way, but it is hard reading. It's
Yeah, yeah.
it's
Like you gotta.
technical. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. That's awesome. I have homework to do. I'm excited.
yeah,
Um, Thank you, Kevin. Thank you for this wonderful conversation. I greatly appreciate the chance to catch up.
yeah. This has been really fun.
Um,
I really appreciate the opportunity.
of course. Maybe I can check in a few months, 6 months from now or so, and see what's up to then.
Yeah, let's do it. We could maybe choose a specific area in one of these things and like take a deep dive, right? And
Awesome.
you can
Awesome.
give yeah.
We didn't talk about Hephaestus. We got to talk about Hephaestus next time.
Oh yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. I'll read up on it and we can chat about
yeah.
it. We'll send
Awesome.
each other reading lists.
Awesome. That's perfect. I'm excited. All
My
right,
pleasure.
sir. Thanks for everything.
Yeah, thank you. See you later.